So this is more an observation and something that I want you to keep your eyes and ears open for, because once somebody points it out to you, this should immediately become apparent. And kind of the more you're aware of it, the more obviously truthful it becomes. So this was something I've been noticing for a long time, but I hadn't really had the words to describe it until a friend of mine pointed it out. And that is, in the vast majority of cases, specialists in a particular area of history will say, well, women weren't treated that bad during my specific time and place, but they were treated poorly everywhere else. And you will find this with pretty much every single person who specializes in that period of history, even if they're female. I remember in first year university, I took a couple courses in medieval history, and in the lectures on the Dark Ages, they're like, well, during this era, women weren't really treated as bad as they were before and after, because society was extremely decentralized, and they played a very important part in running the household. And whenever the men were away at war, they would rely on them to run everything. So things weren't really that bad during the Dark Ages. Women had a lot more rights and power than in previous ages. You're like, okay. And then when I was in high school, I took a course in American history, and they were like, well, women's rights were actually better in colonial Britain and I guess you could say early Republic America, just the first couple decades after the Revolution, because there was far more white women than there were white men. And women tended to live a lot longer than men, and widows could keep the property often of their husband or hold it in trust for their children, and a woman could marry 3 or 4 times and become quite wealthy. And they kind of had their pick of who they wanted to marry because white women were such a valued commodity. And in the book I'm reading now about the British Empire, they're saying even like women who were kind of frumpy servants in India could marry directors because there were so few of them. So yeah, British women had more rights in the colonies, but every other time period in history, things were worse off for them. And then I was also reading a book. I did a couple videos on it about ancient Mesopotamia, and it was actually a female professor who was giving the lecture series, and she went, okay, so it was a patriarchal society, but women were treated pretty well. They were allowed to keep their dowries, which I'm pretty sure is how a dowry works. It's the woman's share of the inheritance, and it's something she keeps, but whatever. But yeah, they were allowed to be civil servants. They were allowed to be tavern keepers and brewers, and they could work on state farms and stuff like that. And like in contrast to other eras, they had a lot more rights. Like it was illegal to beat your wife or to kill her. And it's like, okay, so that's another era. People will say that to a certain extent about Japan, although Japan's even more patriarchal, because it was fairly common for women to receive some form of military training. Um, Women of the samurai caste would often receive, if not the same training, then to a certain extent similar military training to males. The idea being, while the men were away, they were in charge of defending their houses. Also, under European chivalry, nobility was generally speaking ransomed. You would capture people, they would be ransomed. By the time of the Norman conquest, the idea of executing other nobility was regarded as kind of a shocking idea. The Normans were shocked that the British nobility would kill each other. They preferred to imprison or exile each other, as opposed to that. And in particular, noble women were supposed to be, at least theoretically, treated with chivalry. But there was no expectation of that in Japan, so women had to be able to defend themselves. There were also notable examples of female samurai, which to me is partially why I think in Japanese anime it's a lot more common for women to fight, because I think there was a bit more of a tradition of that. Not nearly to the same extent, obviously. They're like, well, women in that society were allowed to do that. I've heard women in Viking societies, because the men were always away on raids, so the property was mostly managed by women, and they held immense power within their homelands. Uh, Another course I took in high school mentioned the Mongols, and Mongol women also apparently had more rights than all the other women in human history. Because once again, they were, while the hordes were out conquering, they were in charge of the farming and administration of the vast majority of the empire. My understanding is also within the Spartan kingdom, because all the men were warriors and disinterested in things like money, the property of the society was almost entirely managed by the women. And you kind of go through, once again, every specialist will say this thing. Now, I'll say there are exceptions, random tribes. There's often a bunch of random tribes that treat women like trash. Islamic societies, at least theoretically, often would generally speaking treat women horribly. Although if you listen to modern liberal professors, they'll say no, women were treated better in Islamic societies. So even if it's not true, you will find a lot of people who will shill for Islam's treatment of women. I'd also say Han Chinese societies were pretty horrific to women, particularly with regards to foot binding. I think it's just a part of Confucian moral system. But like I said, you'll go through it and you'll just find like it's this whole narrative that women never had a role in society is bullshit. In part, it's like there's this Victorian early 20th century notion that women shouldn't work, which is something that just didn't really have that much of a precedent. I mean, it was kind of a nice idea, I guess, but women had worked previously all throughout history. They had owned and run taverns, they had been brewers, laundry, obviously, a lot of important administrative positions. Because, I mean, let's think about this logically for a minute. If you're a king or a lord or someone, who's probably the person you trust the most? It's generally your wife. It could be because she can't really seize power in the same way that your brother can, although brothers were also, or son. Her position is kind of dependent upon you, and she's kind of the closest person to you. So whenever kings would be away, the queen would often act as regent, or at least hold immense power, even if she didn't have a official title. Like I recall with William the Conqueror, his wife was in charge of the French half of his empire while he was away pacifying Britain. And this is very common, and you see this in virtually every civilization. Now, like I said, some societies were, in my view, I'd unironically use the term misogynistic. In a lot of Greek societies, Han Chinese and Islamic, but in a lot of other societies like Germanic ones, English, other Latin societies, women held immense authority, at least behind the scenes. Because generally speaking, most men have affection for their wives, and they'll listen to them, and women often will have a dominant position in raising the children and managing the household. But like I said, you can go to pretty much any specialist historian, and they'll be like, no, women were treated really well during this time period, but every other time period. And then you'll have the next historian say, okay, they were treated well during this time period. The other person says they were treated poorly then, but during their time period, they were treated like trash. So you go through this, and that's basically what you find, and it's interesting. Keep an eye out for it. Just think about it. Think about maybe history courses you've taken or history books you've read, and very soon you'll realize that this is a very common trend. Anyways, I hope that was interesting. I hope you enjoyed the video, and more content to come.